Episode 33, Stimulants, Wired for Discovery. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the arrival of stimulants into Europe and the North American colonies, and how they began to alter the shape of the world, bringing in not just one or two, but 3 plant alkaloids that gave you more energy, kept you awake longer, and temporarily increased focus. There's no way that's not going to shake things up. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know, in Europe, before this age of discovery race between the Spanish and the Portuguese and the world trade extravaganza the Dutch began, just about every mood and mind-altering substance Europeans consumed was a depressant or a hallucinogen. Alcohol was the main one, and up until the 16th century, almost all of it was pretty low ABV, or alcohol by volume, stuff like small beer and cider and ale. They usually topped out around 4 to 6%. If you were fancy with a title or rich and had your own brewers and vintners and cellarers or credit with a merchant, you could get wines and meads that maxed out at about 15% ABV. Earlier, I mentioned it was pretty common to add herbs and roots and berries to your alcohol, groots for beer and, quote, medicinal concoctions for wine. The concept of medicinal wine lives on today as herbal cordials. Think stuff like Jägermeister or Benedictine and the Amoros, aperitifs, and even bitters. But we'll talk more about those guys in the 18th century when distilled spirits make a bigger splash. So some wines and beers, alongside the alcohol, also had plant alkaloids present in them. And most of the ones widely used in Europe not only affected you as alcohol does, but could also give you visions as well. Which means just about all the mind-altering things taken on purpose would make you sleep more, be less rational, and be more forgetful. Not the sort of things that tended to ignite revolutions of thought and kick off fundamental changes in the way humans relate to the natural world. But in the 16th and 17th century, 3 previously unknown plant alkaloids were introduced to Western Europe. They each increased wakefulness, sharpened concentration, and pretty suddenly became reasonably available if you had money or hung out in the right circles. That is, among adventurers, investors, and political movers and shakers. And these new stimulating alkaloids were caffeine, theobromine, and nicotine. Before I get any further, a quick detour to explain plant alkaloids. Short version. Alkaloids are organic, that is, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen-containing compounds that typically taste bitter to humans. They have properties that make them basic on the acid-base scale. They contain at least one nitrogen atom and have a ringed structure. Most of them are chemicals plants manufacture to defend themselves against getting consumed. Many of them work pretty well since they taste yucky, and many are poisonous in smaller or larger amounts. But some of them have backfired as a don't eat me chemical, as they have appealing flavors or interact with our nervous system in ways humans have come to appreciate, which led to more plant consumption. Alkaloids are usually complex enough that using the add and subtract, precipitation, distillation, crystallization, and oxidation methods of chemical construction that chemists had through the 20th century made them impossible to build in the lab. And even the ones we could build later, it was obnoxiously expensive. So alkaloids, then as now, were extracted from plants rather than manufactured, which meant the end result of human appreciation was actually extensive cultivation and way more plants, so an overall win for each plant kind with an appealing alkaloid. For perspective, some of the plant alkaloids already in regular documented use in medieval Europe were opium, which is based on poppy alkaloids, atropine, a poison in belladonna or deadly nightshade, and the chemical from ergot fungus that preys on rye, which sends people mad. That's also an alkaloid, as is the desirable flavor of saffron. And all these plant substances are depressants and or poisons and or hallucinogens. The three alkaloids I'm going to cover here were markedly different because they were stimulants. I mean, sure, nicotine, like atropine, is a pretty good poison. Read Agatha Christie's A Murder in Three Acts for a good look at the nicotine murder trope. But all three alkaloids, when ingested moderately in their whole plant forms, cause little harm and did pretty much the opposite of all the other mind-altering substances at large in 17th century Europe. Mind-altering substances, whether mushrooms, wormwood, low-dose poisons, or alcohol, have long been part of human society. There are even arguments that the earliest human-constructed monumental structures found in Eastern Europe and Central Asia possibly owe their origins to facilitating communal drug experiences. So I'm not going particularly far out on a limb to say that the search for the next good drug was as much a part of the European age of exploration as was the search for gold, jewels, prime farmland, human labor, and cod. If you remember back to my bonus episode on humorism and solidism, medicine in the 17th century was pretty unsystematic. The scientific method as we know it was in its infancy. Germ theory as a clear hypothesis was over 200 years away, and medical treatment as a secular rather than religious endeavor pretty much did not exist. In short, the way Western Europe was doing medicine at this point was rather a hot, chancy mess. Because germ theory was decidedly not a thing, and the cataloging of diseases was frankly a crazy quilt disaster, understanding how ingested chemicals affected illnesses was extremely scattershot. All too often, something was considered a treatment for a disease as long as it made the patient feel different, or was rare and or expensive. Better or worse was often not even important. And the result, which is apparent in any book herbal out there, each chemical that made someone feel different, more relaxed, reduced pain, less nauseous, more nauseous, sweatier, cooler, sleepier, have fresher breath, was seen as a treatment for an extensive list of ailments. If it made the patient feel different, it was considered efficacious. How it was working and whether it actually cured the patient was almost always not the subject of medical writing of the time. That a plant or chemical had any effect at all was the bar it had to get over, not that the patient ended up cured. This, quote, makes me feel different, unquote, attitude sadly persists in the modern era in ways that make lots of terrible chemicals appealing as scam cures. Right. So caffeine, theobromine, and nicotine were all virtually unknown in Europe before the 16th century, except to maybe a literal handful of explorers. The use of each one in their native locations are rich histories that go back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, which I am going to mostly gloss over and abridge, and mostly start just in where Europeans swoop them up, because I'm trying to get to America. So here I go. The first alkaloid to arrive and spread was caffeine. It arrived from two places and two sources, coffee and tea. Coffee from Africa and tea from Asia. Coffee has first records dibs. It entered Western Europe and the realm of things the North American colonists cared about from the Turkish Ottoman Empire and North Africa. The original source of coffee itself is somewhere in Ethiopia. And there's this cute apocryphal story of its discovery, which involves peppy goats and an observant goat herd and a nearby religious compound. But the story only appears in writing in the 17th century in Europe and was probably just effectively marketing copy. But there are generally recognized historical records of it working across the African continent from Ethiopia to the west and north coasts through different religious houses. Because that's where the records were, not that that was the only place coffee was happening. Coffee was definitely present in strains of African Islam, Christianity, and royal houses outside these monotheistic religions from around the 15th century CE forward, which means intimations of coffee culture developing around the 8th or 9th century CE are not bonkers. I'm not digging into which or how, but I do want to point out the history of coffee consumption is presently murky and hard to trace. partly because it happened far away from the places Europeans spent a lot of ink developing our modern study of history, and partly because the 18th and 19th century was filled with Europeans working very hard to scramble and destroy cultures and historical traditions of every African tribe and nation they ran across. But clearly, the discovery, the cultivation, the history, and travel all happened, because we have coffee. And for our story, the bits that are important were the wakey effects of coffee were noticed, and it was considered a really excellent trade good because it was super shelf stable, well, camel stable, in these arid climates. So when it arrived in Western Europe, it was already known as a status item because it was expensive and it had special hardware, and as a medicinal item because it definitely made you feel different than you were currently feeling. Coffee entered Western Europe as a spoil of war through Austria, more or less creating Vienna cafe culture. It also entered as a purely commercial venture through Venice, largely as an offshoot of war and commerce on Malta. From both of these entry points, the coffee house was born in the 17th century. England and France opened tons of them, which led to men staying up late and talking big ideas like free will, letting women air their ideas publicly, representative government, literacy outside the church, and reading Bibles in the local language. Clearly, all of this was an outrage, which led to coffee being taxed, religious leaders writing tracts condemning the coffee houses as dens of vice. Treatises were written about kids these days and their late nights, their wild ideas, and terrible coffee breath. And because printing presses were also an up-and-coming thing, today we still have some of those tracts. We also have some of the bad poetry and wild political speculation of the coffee house culture as well, just to balance things out. But coffee and the sharpened focus and increased peppiness outside of daylight hours for the rich kids and adventurers wasn't the end of things. The coffee houses stayed open, and the whole hot water pots and cups and saucers and brewing paraphernalia were all ready for the arrival of tea. Tea, like beer, has a bajillion books and half a zillion podcasts. So other than pointing out that tea has long been recognized for its energizing and gourmet legacies in China, I'll mostly be skipping ahead to Europeans were exposed to it, and here's how it got to America. Like coffee, it has a cool apocryphal origin story, but this time it's a meditating emperor, a hot cup of water, and some magically wind-borne leaves. Also like coffee, tea moved through Chinese culture and became a status item due to its mind-altering powers, shelf stability, and its relative expensiveness. So when early European diplomatic and attempted trade missions to China were served this mysterious, pleasantly astringent, and energizing boiled herb, it was recognized as something special and started to travel back to Europe. Along with getting limited play as a medicinal herb, it started to share space in coffee houses and royal courts and lounges. While coffee rolled in from the south and east, tea mainly arrived from the north, and the Dutch were largely responsible for setting off the biggest tea craze in Europe. Which leads me to another very quick and, let's face it, one of my all-time favorite tangents. If you've ever looked at what tea is called around the world, it's about 1/3 words that sound like tea and about 2/3 words that sound like cha or chai. What's up with that? In short, in our modern times, cha if by land, tea if by sea. While most dialects of Chinese use the word cha or chai for the beverage, some southern coastal dialects, here specifically the Min, say tea. Also, several languages in the Malay archipelago use the word teh. These are the people the Dutch were trading with when they started bringing tea into Europe. Now, Prince Henry the Navigator's crew had brought cha from Cantonese-speaking Macau in the 16th century. So tea was first cha in England in its very earliest arrivals. When Catherine de Bragança, Infanta of Portugal, and Charles II's wife brought it with her in 1660, it was such a cool thing. So cha mainly circled amongst the royalty. It was fabulously expensive and incredibly exclusionary. When the Dutch showed up with their tea, selling it to anyone with the money to buy it, such as the crowds who frequented the coffee houses, the name tea took over. As you might expect, those in inner circles would call it cha, just to show how cool they were. Anyway, in the 17th century, the Dutch were generally winning the European section of the global trade goods game. So in Europe, if you got your tea by sea, you called it tea. And since the Dutch were the first to bring tea to the growing colonies in North America, and except for Portuguese Brazil, South America, it is tea all over America. Except, yes, it is cha in Brazil. Everywhere in Asia, Eastern and Central Europe that received tea by caravan over land used the cha words. Russia is chai, the Arabian Peninsula is shai, Turkic languages chai, Persian shai, even Greek tsai, and so on. I mean, there's always these outliers, like in Polish where it's called herbata, but look all over Europe, where tea arrived by sea, you get Dutch, thee, French, thee, German, tea, Hungarian, tea. Even the Spanish gave in and say tea. Of course, as you've guessed by now, the Portuguese said cha and say cha now. Along with them, Japan and India also messed this rule up just a little bit. Because India and China share a land border, one would think clearly tea came over land, so yes, Indian chai makes sense. But tea was introduced to India on a large scale by the English, by ship, as stolen IP, stolen agricultural property. But this happened back in the 1600s, when only the royal kids in England were drinking tea and were calling it cha. So the cha name came over to India. Japan received tea over the water too and call it cha, but they got it from either the more northerly Chinese states or ancient Korea, both of which use the word cha. So that's basically how the divide happened. And that's as deep as I'm going to go, otherwise we will never get to the other two chemicals. So let me wrap up caffeine. Coffee and tea were also crashing into the arrival of sugar in Europe. If you think caffeine gets you hopped up as a rich, titled, and entitled noble stripling after years of just getting sloppy drunk on wine, wait to see what happens when you start eating sugared marzipan dainties with your coffee. That's going to be a buzz. Suddenly, instead of just getting drunk and sloppy and messy and making life worse for their also slightly beer-buzzed servants, these guys were staying up late, talking free will, reading and writing books, and some really embarrassing poetry. And it was just about to get crazier. Because from the West this time, the Spanish brought tobacco. Compared to coffee and tea, tobacco, once dried and matured for shipping, was much easier to get a buzz from than the other two. Right from the jump, tobacco was used as the dried, ground, and inhaled snuff, and as an item to smoke. Smoking was the fancy way to mellow out and chill with friends at, you guessed it, the coffee house. But snuff taking, that is, sniffing powdered tobacco and sneezing ferociously, think kind of cocaine before cocaine, was accessible to all who could afford it, and ended up being the vaping of its day. Tobacco, in fact, was the first successful cash crop of the English colonies. They had tried sugar, silk, timber, and gold mining. All of those failed to make great 17th century fortune for reasons. But tobacco worked, and the Virginian tideland soil was great for it. But raising tobacco was work, and lots of it. And this created the first real need for agricultural slaves at scale in the continental British colonies. There were already slaves working sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean by the 16th century, and enslaved Africans were being imported by the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch in the 17th century, which is how those poor unfortunate souls ended up washed up in Virginia in 1619. The English saw the money in labor by purchased humans and went in hard as well. And boy, oh boy, once enslaved Africans started arriving, the white landowners of even the tiniest tracts of land decided this was the answer. Indentured labor, limited-term contract laborers drawn from the urban poor, peasants dispossessed by the Enclosure Acts, and mustered-out soldiers, along with rounded-up orphans, had been the initial workforce. But most of these people, the less than 50% who survived anyway, had to be freed after 7 years of labor, and often given land, which just made for more competition. I mean, children of untraceable provenance and women could be kept in bondage forever. But the former tended to die easily, and the latter, well, as I've mentioned before, women were mostly too valuable to be worked to death in the fields. So the rise of tobacco, snuffed and smoked in Europe, was the real start of African enslavement in North America at scale. It was also the founding of the first real North American fortunes. John Rolfe, John Smith's buddy, Rolfe was the one who married Pocahontas, was one of the first tobacco barons. Many an iron manufacturer back in England also made his fortune sending tools to work American tobacco fields. I talked about this all the way back in episode 1, when I explained how sending tools to grow sugar and tobacco was all tied up in expanding the iron industry of Europe. Not only was the demand for iron exploding in the New World, a chemical to keep the sailor and the iron worker alert longer was flowing back over the ocean to Europe. Caffeine required time, fire, accoutrements, and elaborate rituals to consume. But snuff could be sniffed up in a moment. A noisy sneeze and everything could just continue. So this made tobacco more accessible for the common people, but it also heavily gendered its consumption. There certainly were women who smoked tobacco and a few more who dipped snuff, but this was never done generally by women. It was seen as particularly nasty and was always a mark of dissolution, or at least of sort of wickedness that would keep you out of the best society. And because tobacco was being produced in America, but all coffee and tea were imported, expensive and fancy, tobacco was by far the stimulant of choice amongst the 17th century colonists. When it came to coffee and tea, there was practically none in the British Atlantic colonies. Not none, just practically none. If you were one of the few, say the largest landowners in Virginia, or a cod shipping baron in New England, or living large with your sugar and lemons up in New Amsterdam, coffee and tea were available. But they were so rare and so expensive, they didn't really make much of a mark on 17th century food in the developing American colonies. But tobacco was definitely there. The stuff grown in Virginia for export was mostly strains imported from the Caribbean and South America. This was considered to be smoother and sweeter. But there was tobacco endemic to North America as well. The local tribes colonists alternately traded with for furs and corn, and stole from, and went to war with over land and hunting grounds, and even kidnapped to sell as slaves. These local tribes had their own tobacco. This was aged and dried and traded and smoked and used medicinally. But most of the endemic tobacco stayed in North America, and a fair amount of it, both endemic and export quality, stood in for money. Coins were scarce, and at this point there was no paper money. A dearth of banking in most places made letters of credit largely useless. But tobacco leaves had a known value, were fairly durable, and quite light, so became a reasonable stand-in as currency in many situations. While the local tobacco stayed, the export tobacco, that went back to Europe. And it began to travel backwards up all these global trade routes that had long sent things only to Europe and America. It began to pay for coffee across North and Eastern Africa, and for tea in China, for spices in the Malay archipelago, and even was used along the Gold Coast as exchange for humans who themselves would be used to mine the Virginia soil to grow tobacco. And I do say mine because just as with the grain farmers who found themselves with less productive fields after a decade, the tobacco farmers would suck the nutrients out of the Virginia soil in as few as 5 years. They'd have to acquire new land, clear it, and start a whole new concern, where the grain farmers could often stave off emptied soil a bit longer because they were plowing with oxen and it had a bit of cow manure about. The tobacco farmers, due to the hillock cultivation habit of tobacco, used exclusively human labor. There was practically no animal manure to feed the soil. But the cereal land clearing would result in the Virginia colony opening up in the 18th century for grain and other foodstuffs to make it much more self-sufficient, and would result in the post-tobacco areas growing other high-labor cash crops along with the food. And before I move on, one more funny coincidence around tobacco. Especially among the poorer colonists who had neither the pipes to smoke it or the mills to grind it to snuff, and when it just wasn't a handy time to smoke, chewing plugs of tobacco grew as a habit. And the glob of tobacco chomped on was called a chaw, C-H-A-W. But in speech, that was the same as the fancy English reference to tea, cha. I'm sure many a rustic American celebrity on tour in 19th century London went on to purposefully misunderstand that one in the better circles of English society to great hilarity and scandal. Now, the last plant alkaloid to invade Europe was theobromine through cocoa. Cocoa beans arrived along with tobacco in those first Columbian voyages, but it required more ceremony and its effects were less obvious than tobacco's, so it languished in the Spanish court for a time. In its first incarnation, cocoa, or drinking chocolate, or chocolatl, as it was often known, was an even more elaborate preparation than coffee or tea. Also, initially it wasn't sweetened. Chocolatl was ground and combined with the cinnamon and chili and saffron and cloves and whatnot everyone was throwing into the mix to show off their spice cupboards. It was elaborately mixed and repeatedly poured to produce a foam. It was a largely ceremonial, royal adult drink, astringent, spicy, and challenging. But by landing in the royal Spanish court alongside sugar, especially in this age of Baroque complex sauces, something changed. Sugar and then milk were added. While tobacco became a thing for the men, chocolate was on its way to becoming a genteel drink suitable for family gatherings, for fine ladies, and even for pampered children. Theobromine won't give you a buzz the same way nicotine and caffeine do, but it definitely is a stimulant, though softer. So cocoa beans definitely fell into the category of medicinal. They made you feel different than before. It was also expensive and complex, so it definitely had that goop factor as a medicine. But with the addition of sugar and cream, well, it frankly tasted too good to be taken seriously as a medicine the way tea, coffee, and tobacco would continue to be for a bit longer. So chocolate made very little to no impression in most of the British Atlantic colonies. The English shipping trade had no cocoa trade routes, so there was almost no interest in buying or selling or consuming this American product in British North American colonies. It was mixing with sugar and the rest of the stimulants in Europe, but was making no impression at this point in the future U.S. As I mentioned last time, it was probably being enjoyed in limited ways up in New Amsterdam, along with the confirmed consumption of coffee and tea. But at this point, for all practical purposes, chocolate was a stranger outside the lands claimed by Spain. So this is where things stand at the end of the 17th century. Cocoa is basically unknown in the British colonies because the Spanish control its sale and export. Coffee and tea are adored by the rich and idle who have the cash to buy them and the time to ritually consume them. Coffee started with the upper hand, but as the British got into the tea plantation biz in India, it viewed its colonies as a marketplace for this product, just as with metal hose and wool cloth. As a result, coffee, which England did not control, was nudged aside. But tobacco, as the local cash crop, that was much more accessible to the locals. So for much of the 17th century, tobacco, chewed, smoked, and snuffed, was the colonial stimulant of choice. Because of its local origins and largely gendered consumption and its price, its uptake in the 18th century American polite society would be limited to certain times and places. which meant that tea would take over first place as stimulant of choice. But all of that will have to wait for the 18th century and season 2. So next week, I will be getting into some of the interesting reasons why Americans and most other English-speaking countries mostly don't eat horses, while the rest of the world mostly does, or is at least ambivalent about it. There's sense, and there's also sensibilities. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Thanks to those of you that have left a rating for the show, but hearing from more of you can help me make this a better show and make it more visible to other food history curious people out there. More of the podcast widgets are letting you rate things these days, so if you can, please do. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also on the show's Twitter bio, @THOA Food, and in the show description.